What did we see? This is the idea, but I leave the PowerPoint behind so you can get a PowerPoint. But this is that idea of what we call powerful plurilingual learning environments, where there is an outer circle and a middle circle. But I mean, we have articles on that, so you can read on that later. What did we see in terms of socio-affective effects through pre-post tests? Positive effect on well-being and on self-confidence. Other non-cognitive variables, no effect. Classroom involvement, no effect. There was no more classroom involvement in these experiment schools where the teachers were trained and professionalized to use and to exploit the children's repertoires in the learning process. These are things like, you two are Turkish, you're doing a math activity, you don't understand it, please can you help him, and you can use Turkish. Things that were completely forbidden before that. So, what did we see with the teachers when it came to socio-affective effects through questionnaires and interviews? The questionnaire, an overall positive effect on well-being of pupils. That's what all teachers said, and it was even stronger reflected in the interviews, an improvement in the eagerness to speak. Interesting. Teachers who said that due to the fact that we allowed the kids, we exploited the kids' language repertoires in the learning process, they became more eager to speak. Teachers said before the project, we often saw children who said nothing, because the reality was when they were doing group work, I was walking around, wandering around as a police person, saying, Turkish, only Dutch. What happened was the interaction went completely down. And we all know when there is no interaction, that there's no learning, no language learning going on. Positive, an improvement in children's well-being, involvement in classrooms. Things like, I feel that some children have fully blossomed. The fear of public speaking has completely disappeared. I think that our relationship has become a bit closer. Maybe I should say more bonding. The idea that teachers said before, there was hardly any bond between me and a lot of the children. This is a G2 classroom. Now they are all interested in reading. The motivation is much higher. I think it's wonderful to see how the kids have opened up by learning to read in Turkish first. Effects on Dutch language proficiency. Interesting thing was, there was during the 4 years project, there was an ongoing debate on, when we introduced that idea of a pedagogical environment where the teachers exploit the multilingual repertoires of these children, do we have to look at whether that benefits their L2 learning, or do we have to look at the fact whether it has a negative effect on children's L2 learning? We said, let's go for the second one, because most teachers are convinced of the fact that when you exploit the languages of these kids, it will have a negative effect. There is a strong belief that that will have a negative effect on their L2 learning. What we saw was that on the basis of the test, there was no negative effect on L2 learning. At the same time, you can also say there was no positive effect. But I don't expect to have a positive effect on an L2 learning when there is not specifically more done with the children's L1s. At least that's what we learned from, amongst others, Cameron's theory. So when we interviewed the teachers, there were clearly mixed beliefs when it came to what extent does it contribute to children's L2 acquisition. I think that because of the project, the children are much more involved with language. They're now talking in their own language, but I don't think that they speak less Dutch, no, certainly not. But at the same time, a teacher of a G2 class, I think that they feel more confident, more at ease, but whether their Dutch improves, I don't know. Actually, I have my doubts. So still there were doubts amongst teachers, but the test gave a clear result that there were no negative effects on L2. So the kids in the experiment schools where the L1s were exploited had the same results on the language test as the kids in the control schools. Effects on Turkish language proficiency, interesting. I told you that one part of the experiment was first learned to read and write the kids in Turkish as a step towards second language, there we saw no effect on their Turkish proficiency, and that was very, at first for us that was very odd. You first learn to read and write them in Turkish, and we saw no effects on their Turkish proficiency. Afterwards, it didn't came as a surprise, because as I already said, one of the outcomes of the consensus that the Minister of Education and the education people of the city of Ghent had was that initially they wanted to have this part of the project up to 8 to 10 hours of teaching of Turkish, and they had to reduce it to 3-4 hours. And from that moment on, we said, well, the possibility of finding positive effects are definitely will be definitely influenced. But the Turkish teachers who we interviewed, they expressed that they saw a very positive effect on children's language proficiency. Interesting thing, I'm not going into the methodological debate, but in all cases we saw often a difference in what we found in the from the quantitative data compared to the qualitative data. Did it have impact on teachers? Oops, 0 minutes. Did it have impact on teachers? There was more acceptance of home language use in informal situations by all teachers. There was much more spontaneous interaction in the home language. Occasionally we saw activities that focused on language awareness, and there was a lot more peer tutoring going on where children could use their mother tongues. I'm going to skip all that. That was an example. What we also saw was a very strong impact on teachers' perceptions and teachers' attitudes and their beliefs towards home languages. All the four experiment schools at the end said we never want to go back to the situation before. The school that had the banner with Dutch only now have the opposite. Now they have banners where they say that it is positive that kids can use their home languages. So, exploiting the linguistic repertoires has no negative effect on L2 acquisition. It has positive effects on children's well-being and their self-confidence. It has positive effects on the multilingual classroom practices and on teachers' attitudes. The traditional bilingual program, again, the methodological context was very restricted, but in this project we saw no negative effects on L2 acquisition, but we saw no effects on L1 acquisition either. And interestingly, in the mainstream classroom, due to the traditional bilingual program, there were no effects on well-being and self-confidence. There was in the Turkish classroom, but it didn't transfer into the mainstream classroom, and this I think is Constant also asked us to raise a couple of questions. Now, what I'm intrigued in, because I'm coming from that Belgian Flemish context, what is the prevailing language learning and teaching paradigm in the British schools? Is a shift towards a more performance-based approach necessary in general? And what are the negative or positive consequences? To what extent are children's L1 exploited or ignored or banned? Do you have similar situations here in the UK as we have in France? Do we need to explore their linguistic repertoires at school and in the classroom, and what are the possible negative and positive effects? And finally, the most important question, which already popped up during the discussion and in Angela's presentation, what is the impact of exploiting these repertoires as a kind of pedagogy in the classroom? What is the impact on language assessment and language assessment practices? Thank you.